The wind was a cleaver, slicing across the high plains, carrying grit and the first icy bite of a coming storm. Alara pulled the worn wool tighter, her breath misting instantly. The ranch house hunched low on the land, a solitary scar against the vast, indifferent sky. For 5 years, since the fever had claimed her husband and left her brittle and alone, this place had been her cage and her sanctuary. It offered silence, which she craved, but also isolation, which was a slow, persistent ache. She was a woman alone in a man's world, carving existence from unforgiving soil and the judgment of distant neighbors who saw her as either stubborn or foolish. The storm hit like a fist just before dusk, a wall of gray snow that swallowed the horizon, reducing the world to the few feet visible outside the frosted windowpane. The wind shrieked, a sound that always found the hollow places inside her. Huddling by the small, spitting fire, Alara listened, the storm a physical presence pressing against the thin walls. It was in this chaos, a sound distinct from the wind's howl reached her, a thud, then a faint groan near the barn. Fear, sharp and cold, spiked in her gut. This land held dangers known and unknown. Rustlers, wolves, or worse, the casual cruelty of men. But a groan, a human sound amidst the storm's fury. Caution warred with something deeper, a buried instinct for aid, perhaps a residue of the woman she'd been before loneliness wore her down. Clutching a heavy lantern, she wrestled the barn door open against the wind's brutal push. The snow swirled inside, catching the lantern's weak light. He lay crumpled near the feed bins, a dark shape half buried in white. As she cautiously approached, the light fell upon him. Young, so young, a boy, not much more than a child, clad in deerskin soaked dark with snow and something else, red. Fear surged again, but this time it tasted different, not of attack, but of stark, undeniable vulnerability. He was native, his face a mask of pain, eyes squeezed shut, breath shallow. An arrow protruded from his side, a grim feather stirring faintly in the draft. Panic fluttered. Taking in a native, especially one injured, was dangerous. The tensions were a constant, simmering threat in this territory. She could leave him. The storm would claim him soon enough. No one would know. The thought was a black, bitter seed. But looking at the boy's face, so young, so clearly suffering, she saw not an enemy, but simply a human being in desperate need. It mirrored, in a strange way, her own silent, desperate need for connection, for purpose beyond mere survival. In the lantern's small circle of light, the vast, hostile world outside seemed to recede. Here was a choice, stark and immediate. Humanity whispered louder than fear. She knelt, her movements hesitant, then firmer. He was barely conscious, impossible to leave. With effort that strained her weary muscles, she began to pull him towards the relative shelter within the barn. Away from the storm's relentless bite, a silent, heavy decision weighing in the sudden, strange quiet of the barn's interior. Dragging him proved harder than she expected, the boy a dead weight despite his size. She managed to pull him onto a pile of straw, shielding him from the worst of the drafts cutting through the barn walls. The arrow was deep, too deep for her clumsy, untried hands. All she could do was stem the bleeding as best she could with torn strips of an old linen sheet she kept for rags. The boy moaned faintly under her touch, but his eyes remained closed, lashes frosted white. His breathing was still shallow, ragged. Alara worked by the flickering lantern light, her shadow dancing monstrously on the barn walls. Her initial fear had dulled into a tense, practical focus. Clean the wound, keep him warm, keep him alive through the night. The implications of having him here hammered at the edge of her thoughts, but she pushed them back. Survival, his and hers in this moment, was the only reality. She fetched more blankets, old horse blankets that smelled faintly of dust and animal, layering them over him. She debated moving him to the house, but the effort was too great, and the thought of him inside, in her small, solitary space, felt overwhelmingly transgressive. The barn felt safer, somehow, a neutral ground away from the intimate fear his presence sparked in her home. She sat near him, the lantern casting a small pool of warmth. The storm outside raged unabated, a constant reminder of the world's indifference. She watched him, this stranger, this boy who had landed on her doorstep out of the storm's fury. His face, even in sleep or unconsciousness, held a quiet dignity. She noticed the beadwork on his simple moccasins, the dark braid of his hair peeking from beneath the blankets. He was someone's son, someone's brother. The thought pricked her. She had lost everyone. The vast empty rooms of her house echoed with that loss. Perhaps that was why she hadn't left him. The shared vulnerability of existence in this brutal landscape. Hours crawled by. The barn was cold, but the layered blankets seemed to be holding the chill at bay. He shifted once, a sharp intake of breath, and she tensed, ready to recoil, but he settled again. She found a tin cup and filled it with water from a pail, setting it near his head. He did not stir to drink. The silence in the barn, broken only by the wind's distant howl and the boy's faint breaths, was profound. It was a shared silence, two souls huddled against the night, an unlikely, fragile truce forged by desperation and circumstance. Elara leaned back against the rough wood of the barn wall, exhaustion heavy in her limbs. She did not sleep, not truly. Every rustle, every creak of the barn in the wind, brought her instantly alert. She was a sentinel in her own small territory, guarding a life that had been thrust upon her. As the night wore on, the raw fear that had gripped her earlier began to soften, replaced by a weary sense of responsibility. She had made a choice. Now she had to see it through. The first hint of gray light filtering under the barn door brought not relief, but a fresh wave of anxiety. Daybreak, the time for discovery. The storm had broken. The wind was still, the sky a pale, washed-out gray bruised with the last vestiges of dawn. Elara rose stiffly from her vigil, her body aching from the cold floor. She checked the boy. His breathing seemed a little stronger, though he was still deeply unconscious. The bleeding had slowed, clotted beneath the makeshift bandage. What now? She couldn't keep him here, not safely. She couldn't take him anywhere. Discovery meant certain trouble, potentially violence. Her mind raced, searching for an answer that didn't exist. She stepped outside the barn, into the crisp, cold air. The world was transformed, muffled by a blanket of fresh snow. The ranch stretched out white and silent, under the weak morning light. It was beautiful, desolate, and utterly empty. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, trying to steel herself for the impossible decisions ahead. And then she saw them. Across the snow-covered meadow that stretched before her small rise, they stood. A line, long and silent, silhouetted against the pale sky. Horses and riders. Dozens of them. More than dozens. As her eyes adjusted, counting instinctively, her blood ran cold. There were nearly 100. Warriors. Clad in winter hides, feathers and paint barely visible at this distance. But their presence was unmistakable, radiating a quiet power that froze her where she stood. They were too far away to pose an immediate threat, but their sheer number, their silent, watchful stillness was terrifying. They hadn't come for her, surely? They must be searching for the boy. Her first instinct was to flee, to hide, to deny she had seen anything. But where could she go? The house was vulnerable, the barn even more so. And the boy, he was in the barn. Her presence outside, her obvious discovery of them, made hiding impossible. She stood framed in the barn doorway, a solitary figure against the white landscape, exposed and trembling. The warriors remained motionless, a dark, silent line against the snow. Time seemed to stretch and distort, the silence between her and them charged with an unbearable tension. She could feel their eyes upon her, 100 pairs of eyes assessing, waiting. Inside the barn, the boy stirred. A small sound, a whimper of pain. It broke through her paralyzing fear. He was still alive. Because of her. The connection, fragile as it was, snapped her back to the present. She couldn't abandon him now. Not after the night they had shared. a night where humanity had outweighed fear. She took a shaky breath, straightening her shoulders. There was nowhere to run. She would face whatever came. She expected movement, a charge, a shout. But still, they waited. The silence felt significant now, less like a threat and more like a question. A test. She took a tentative step forward, out of the barn's shadow, into the open snow. The cold seeped through her boots, but she barely felt it. Her gaze was fixed on the distant line of warriors. There was no hostility in their posture, only this profound, unnerving stillness. The air crackled not with impending violence, but with anticipation. What did they want? The answer felt tied to the boy inside the barn. It was about him. It had to be about him. She stood her ground, a small, determined figure in the vast, indifferent landscape, waiting for the silent 100 to make their move, her heart pounding a heavy, anxious rhythm against her ribs. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Elara stood in the snow, the biting cold a dull ache compared to the sharp edge of her fear. The line of warriors remained motionless, a dark, silent wall against the morning light. Then, from the center of the line, a single figure moved. An older man, his face lined and etched with the harshness of the land, but his bearing regal. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in a slow, deliberate gesture. And then, one by one, the warriors followed suit. They raised their hands, palms facing outwards, a universal sign of peace, of respect. Then, in unison, they dipped their heads, a deep, silent bow towards her, the lone woman standing before her barn. It was a salute, a gesture of profound, unspoken thanks. Elara stared, stunned. Her fear, which had been a physical weight in her chest, began to dissolve, replaced by a rush of disbelief, then a wave of overwhelming emotion. They knew she had taken the boy in. They knew she had sheltered him through the storm. And this was their acknowledgement. Not with words, which would have been difficult across the distance and the cultural divide, but with a gesture that transcended language. 100 warriors, fierce and formidable, offering a silent, powerful tribute to a simple act of unexpected kindness in a world that offered little of it. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the figures across the meadow. She felt stripped bare, her isolation and fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this immense, silent gratitude. She didn't know what to do, how to respond to such a profound display. Hesitantly, she raised her own hand, offering a small, shaky gesture of acknowledgement in return. Felt inadequate, but it was all she had. The leader held his hand raised for another moment, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then, slowly, he turned his horse. One by one, the others turned, their movements synchronized, silent. Without a sound, they began to ride away, back the way they had come, disappearing over the gentle swell of the land as if they had been a mirage. Elara stood watching until the last rider vanished. The only evidence of their presence, the faint tracks left in the pristine snow. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not empty, but resonant. She looked back at the barn, at the life she had sheltered within. It had been just a night, a few hours out of a lonely existence, but it had changed something fundamental within her. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it was tempered by the unexpected grace she had witnessed. She had acted out of simple humanity, despite the risks, despite her own desolation. And in doing so, she had connected, however briefly and silently, with the vast, complex world outside her small ranch, finding not the cruelty she often expected, but a deep, powerful wellspring of reciprocal respect. The plains still stretched wide and empty before her. The work was still hard, and the loneliness would likely return. But she carried something new within her now, the quiet strength born of facing fear and choosing compassion, and the memory of 100 silent warriors offering their thanks beneath the pale morning sky. The ranch was still solitary, but she no longer felt entirely alone.